Story 1. The Deacon's Shadow. Have you ever been alone in a place that was meant to feel safe, but instead you felt watched? That strange, stomach-knotting feeling. Like someone's eyes are burning into your back, but when you turn around, there's no one there. That's how it started for David Whitmore. David wasn't an easily frightened man. At 47 years old, he had been the deacon of St. Luke's Baptist Church for nearly 2 decades. He was the type of person who never missed a service, who volunteered to lock up after everyone left, who walked the halls alone at night without a second thought. But on that particular night, he should have left earlier. The church was empty, the air thick with a lingering scent of burnt candles and old hymn books. The sound of his own footsteps echoed through the wooden floorboards. It was just him, the dim lighting of the sanctuary, and the eerie silence that stretched between the pews. David had stayed behind, checking the offering box, making sure the Bibles were stacked neatly, and securing the back entrance, like he always did. Routine. Nothing unusual. But then, he heard it. A soft creak from the back of the church. He froze. His eyes lifted toward the rear pews. Nothing. Maybe it was the wood settling. That's what he told himself. He exhaled, shaking his head. Getting paranoid in your old age, Whitmore. And then, a whisper. Faint. So faint that he wasn't sure he'd actually heard it. It was low, almost a hushed breath against his ear. You shouldn't be here. David spun around so fast that he nearly lost his balance. His breath hitched in his throat. No one was there. The church was empty. The doors were locked. A creeping coldness spread down his spine, his hands turning clammy as he wiped them against his slacks. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to move, convincing himself that it was just his imagination. He continued toward the altar, tidying up the hymnals. That's when he saw it. The cross above the pulpit, it was tilting. His brows pulled together in a frown. That cross was bolted into the wall. It had never moved before. Not in all his years of being here. David swallowed. Something wasn't right. He backed away slowly, his eyes locked on the shifting cross, when suddenly, all the candles blew out at once. A thick darkness swallowed the church, the only light coming from the street lamp outside the stained glass windows. The silence was deafening. And then, the footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from behind the altar. David's heart hammered against his ribs as he turned his head, barely breathing. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, elongating, shifting, as if something was standing just out of sight. He wasn't alone. His mouth was dry. He took a step back, his shoe scuffing against the wood. The footsteps stopped. Then, a low, guttural exhale filled the room. Right behind him. David bolted. He didn't care about his duties anymore, didn't bother tidying up the hymnals or checking the offering box. He sprinted down the aisle, his breath ragged, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys in his pocket. As he reached the doors, a deep, creaking groan filled the air, the sound of the wooden pews shifting on their own. David didn't look back. He didn't want to see whatever it was. He unlocked the doors, stumbled into the night, and slammed them shut behind him. The moment the cold air hit his face, he felt like he could breathe again. But the church windows loomed behind him, and as he turned to look one last time, in the faint glow of the streetlight, through the large stained glass window above the altar, he saw it. A figure. Tall. Featureless. Wrapped in the shadows. Standing exactly where he had been just moments ago. Watching. Waiting. David never spoke about that night. Not to his wife. Not to the congregation. He still showed up every Sunday, still did his duties as a deacon. But something was different. He stopped staying late. Stopped walking alone in the empty halls. And every night, as he lay in bed, he swore he could still hear it. That low whisper. You shouldn't be here. Story 2. The Nun Who Never Left. If you have ever heard footsteps in an empty hallway before, you will agree with this one. Soft, measured steps. A slow, deliberate movement. You hold your breath, listening, waiting, expecting to see someone round the corner. But no one does. The air is still. The silence, suffocating. And yet, the footsteps continue. That was the first sign for Sister Angela Rossi. She had been at St. Mary's Monastery for 3 months before she began noticing it. At first, it was subtle. A flickering candle that refused to stay lit. A hymn book left open on a pew she was certain had been closed. The smell of rotting flowers in the chapel, despite the vases being freshly changed. Nothing that couldn't be explained. At least, that's what she told herself. She had come to St. Mary's, a small, secluded convent in the Italian countryside, in search of peace. A place of worship, of solitude. Away from the world, away from distractions. Away from sin. But what she found was something else entirely. Her first real encounter happened on a Wednesday night. The convent was quiet, the other nuns already asleep in their rooms. Angela had stayed in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, praying. That's when she heard it. A soft knocking. It wasn't coming from the chapel doors. It was coming from below. From underneath the floorboards. Angela's fingers froze on her rosary, her breath catching in her throat. The knocking was slow, rhythmic, almost a pattern. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more knocks. She turned her head, expecting, hoping, to see one of the sisters nearby. But the chapel was empty. The candlelight flickered violently, as if the air itself had grown heavy. The knocking stopped. Then, a whisper. Right next to her ear. Mother Superior doesn't want you to know. Angela stumbled to her feet, her heart pounding against her ribs. She turned so fast that her veil slipped from her hair. No one was there. The chapel was empty. The air was still. And yet, she felt watched. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Angela asked one of the older nuns, Sister Beatrice, if there was a basement beneath the chapel. The woman stiffened, her face turning pale. There is nothing beneath the chapel, she said quickly. But I heard knocking. Sister Beatrice gripped her rosary tighter. You heard nothing. We do not speak of such things here. Angela pressed further, but no one would talk. That night, she did something she wasn't supposed to do. She went to the convent's archives. She searched through old, handwritten records, flipping through yellowed pages, reading through decades of history. That's when she found it. Sister Maria. The name had been crossed out in thick, black ink, as if someone had tried to erase her entirely. But Angela could still make out some of the details. Sister Maria. Entered St. Mary's in 1928. Accused of heresy in 1931. Removed from the convent. That was all it said. No details. No reason. Nothing. But something about that word, removed, made Angela's stomach churn. Had she left, or had she been buried? The night Angela saw her. 3 days later, Angela woke up in the middle of the night. She wasn't sure why, until she realized that her door was slightly open. Someone had been inside. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly sat up in bed, her fingers tightening around her blanket. The hallway outside was pitch black. Then, she heard the footsteps. Soft. Measured. Coming from the chapel. Angela stood, moving slowly, cautiously. She stepped into the hallway, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floor. The air felt thick, heavy, almost like it was pushing against her. She turned the corner and saw her. A nun stood at the altar, motionless. The candlelight cast long, unnatural shadows across her form. Her hands were folded in prayer, her veil covering her face. But something was wrong. Angela took a slow step forward. The figure didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. Then Angela saw it. The nun's lips were sewn shut. A jagged line of black stitches ran across her mouth, the thread tight and aged, as if it had been done long ago. Angela's breath shook, her legs weakening beneath her. That's when the nun's head snapped toward her. Not slowly, not naturally. It was too fast, too sudden, like a puppet whose strings had been yanked. Angela couldn't breathe. The nun's hollow eyes bore into hers, and despite the stitches, Angela heard a whisper. "Help me." The candles extinguished all at once. The doors slammed shut. And Angela ran. The next morning, Angela was summoned by Mother Superior. She was told, in a cold, even tone, that she was being transferred to another convent immediately. No explanation. No discussion. Angela tried to ask about Sister Maria, but the older woman shook her head. Sister Maria was never removed, Mother Superior said, her voice barely above a whisper. She never left. Angela packed her things and left that same evening. But as the car pulled away, she glanced back at the chapel. And in the arched window of the second floor, behind the veil of the heavy curtains, she saw her, standing perfectly still, watching, waiting. And though Angela was far away, she still heard the whisper, "Help me." Story 3. The Possession of Father Michael. What would you do if you realized your prayers were being answered by something that wasn't God? That's the question Father Michael Harrington never wanted to ask himself. He was a man of faith. Strong, unwavering, devoted. A priest at St. Augustine's Church, a small parish in rural Pennsylvania, where the congregation trusted him, loved him. For 30 years, he had stood before his people, delivering sermons, blessing marriages, baptizing newborns, and offering comfort to the grieving. But Father Michael had never performed an exorcism. Not until the Donahue case. Not until the thing that left that girl followed him home. It was a stormy Friday evening when the Donahues arrived at St. Augustine's. A husband and wife, terrified, clutching their teenage daughter between them. The girl, Eleanor, was barely recognizable. Her once soft brown hair was matted, her skin gray and sunken, her eyes dark hollows, rimmed with exhaustion. But it was her expression that disturbed Father Michael the most. She wasn't scared. She was grinning. "Father," Mrs. Donahue had pleaded, tears streaking her face, "we've tried everything. Doctors, therapists, even another priest. They wouldn't touch her. Please," her husband whispered, his voice shaking. "You're our last hope." Father Michael had never performed an exorcism before. But when he looked into Eleanor's eyes, he felt something deep in his gut. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He agreed. The exorcism took place in the back of the church, in a private prayer room. Candles flickered in the dim light as the storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the stained glass windows. Eleanor sat in the chair, hands bound with thick rosary beads, her head tilted slightly, like she was listening to something just beyond the walls. Father Michael took a breath and began. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." A low, guttural laugh cut him off. It came from Eleanor. She was staring at him, her lips curling into an unnatural, twisted smile. "Father Michael," she whispered, her voice distorted, stretched. His blood ran cold. "You have sins, don't you?" He tightened his grip on the crucifix. Eleanor's body jerked violently, her head snapping back as a sharp wail erupted from her throat. The walls shuddered, the air grew thick, and the candles extinguished all at once. Then, the smell hit him, a putrid stench of decay, thick and suffocating. She started whispering, a language he didn't recognize, her tongue moving too fast, her voice overlapping as if there were two voices inside of her. Father Michael's hands shook as he pressed the cross to her forehead. "Demon, I command you, leave this child." Eleanor's body arched violently, her eyes rolling back. A deep, inhuman scream tore through the room. And then, silence. She slumped forward, her breath shallow. The storm outside had stopped. Father Michael exhaled, his heart pounding in his chest. The Donahues rushed to their daughter, sobbing, thanking him over and over. It was over, or so he thought. That night, Father Michael went home. He lived alone in a small cottage next to the church, surrounded by empty fields and towering trees. It was peaceful, quiet, but not anymore. At exactly 3 a.m., he woke up suddenly, his room unnaturally cold. His breath billowed in front of him, as if he had stepped into the dead of winter. Then, he heard it. A faint, scraping sound. It was coming from the ceiling. His chest tightened as he sat up, staring at the dark wooden beams above him. The sound was slow, methodical, like fingernails dragging across wood. His stomach twisted. The air felt wrong. And then, a whisper. "Father Michael." His breath hitched. The voice wasn't coming from the ceiling anymore. It was right next to his bed. His head snapped to the side. Nothing. But the darkness in the corner of the room felt deeper, heavier, like something was standing there, watching. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then, his bedroom door creaked open. Slow, deliberate, revealing the dark hallway beyond. Father Michael's entire body went rigid, because standing there was Eleanor. No, not Eleanor. Her mouth stretched into an inhuman grin, her eyes hollow pits of black. "Did you think you got rid of me?" The next morning, Father Michael arrived at Sunday Mass, but he wasn't himself. The congregation noticed immediately. His skin was pale, his hands trembling. As he stepped onto the altar, his voice faltered. He gripped the pulpit tightly, his knuckles white. Then, he stopped speaking. A long, unnatural silence filled the church. And then, he laughed. A deep, twisted chuckle, like multiple voices laughing at once. The congregation gasped. Father Michael lifted his head. His eyes had turned completely black. He began speaking in a language no one understood, his body jerking violently, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. The crucifix behind him fell from the wall. People screamed. The church erupted into chaos. Father Michael collapsed onto the floor, his body convulsing, his mouth moving silently, whispering something over and over. When they rushed to him, he was unresponsive. His lips, cracked and bleeding, formed a single word. Eleanor. Father Michael was never seen again. His room was found abandoned, the door wide open, his belongings untouched. But on the walls of the church, scratch marks remained. Marks that shouldn't have been possible. Deep gouges in the stone, forming words no one dared to translate. And every night, at 3 a.m., the church security cameras capture the pulpit, where the priest once stood. And sometimes, a figure is standing there, watching, waiting.